In 1895, the world stood at the edge of a conflict that could have changed history forever. A dispute over a remote stretch of jungle in Venezuela nearly ignited a war between the United States and the British Empire. In your timeline, diplomacy prevailed. But in this alternate history, it does not. This is the world in 1895. The British Empire, ruled by Queen Victoria, is the dominant power, controlling about 1/4 of the world's land and population. France is a republic, also with a large empire. German Kaiser is Wilhelm II. Germany is militarily powerful, rapidly industrializing, and seeking overseas colonies. The Russian Empire is ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, who, in your timeline, was murdered during the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Franz Joseph I is the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. Italy is a newly unified state in 1861. Spain is in decline after losing its South American colonies. There are already rising tensions with the United States over Cuba, which will lead to the Spanish-American War in the coming years. The United States is not yet a superpower, but it is growing fast. Cities rise upward, factories are expanding, and railroads bind the continent together. And with that growth comes new ambitions. Japan is another emerging power, rapidly modernizing. China is ruled by the weak Qing dynasty under Emperor Guangxu. Ottoman Empire is in steady decline. In Latin America, there are mostly independent states, although some experience political instability. The world is undergoing rapid technological changes. Electricity is in rapid development. Cities like New York, London, and Berlin have electric street lighting. Rail networks is expanding. There are already tens of thousands of kilometers of track. There are the first automobiles. Steamships has replaced sail for ocean travel. Auguste and Louis Lumière have held the first public film screening in Paris in December 1895. Meanwhile, in Venezuela, there is a long-standing dispute between Great Britain and Venezuela about the territory of Essequibo. The dispute became a diplomatic crisis in 1895 when U.S. President Grover Cleveland argued that British behavior violated the Monroe Doctrine, which declared that European powers should not interfere in the Americas. This principle was known as the Monroe Doctrine. In our timeline, cooler minds, a rare commodity in the early 1900s, found a diplomatic solution. British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury accepted American arbitration, and in exchange the Americans ruled in favor of the British, granting them 90% of the disputed territory. In this way, the Americans, at the expense of the Venezuelans, obtained British acceptance of the Monroe Doctrine. However, American leaders may think they can achieve more than the mere acceptance of the Monroe Doctrine. They might have seen this as an opportunity to drive the British out of the American continent, a first step toward becoming the world's leading power in their place. The United States and the United Kingdom were in a sort of Cold War for over a century after U.S. independence, with Canada as the main point of tension. At that time, Americans were fixated on Canada, almost in the same way that China is fixated on Taiwan today. The British, on their side, could begin to realize that the real threat to their empire was not the German Navy, the Russians in Asia, the Boers, or the Zulu, but the United States itself. And it is necessary to stop the U.S. before it's too late. Better a bloody war now than the loss of global hegemony later. Sure, Britain is the United States' main trading partner. But the Germans and the French were also major trading partners in 1870 and 1914, and we all know how that turned out. This would have been the third conflict between the two nations since the founding of the United States. I know, a war between these two English-speaking countries in 1895 is unlikely, but so was World War I. Everyone knew it was madness and expected a diplomatic resolution before August. Let's begin. In July 1895, American Secretary of State Richard Olney declares that the United States has been brought to believe that in Venezuela Britain is in the wrong, that the vital interests of the United States are involved. Britain replies that it could protect its interests in South America without asking for U.S. permission. The United States is seen as a young nation with much to learn, ambitious, loud, but not yet equal in stature. In August 1895, President Cleveland declares that it is the duty of the United States to resist this aggression by all means. This is a direct threat of war with the United Kingdom. In September 1895, Britain sends a naval expedition with its newest classes of ships in Guyana and begins a naval show of force along the coast of Venezuela. In response, the U.S. President sends a naval squadron with gunboats to Caracas. Meanwhile, public opinion in both countries are already at war. The American media launch an extensive propaganda campaign that generates enormous popular support in favor of Venezuela. The same scheme that led to war with Spain and with Germany in the two world wars is repeated. There are pamphlets denouncing British aggression in Venezuela, and U.S. public opinion grow angry. Many are calling for the Monroe Doctrine to be enforced with blood. British public opinion, on the other hand, finds that uncivilized second-rate republic quite irritating. There is a lot of pressure to teach a lesson to that arrogant country that is challenging Great Britain's prestige. At this point, gasoline is everywhere. All you need is a spark. Perhaps a gunboat, no matter whether British or American, is accidentally engaged by a cruiser with casualties, or a ship, no matter whether British or American, is sunk by an explosion. Probably an accident, but who knows? Or a Lusitania, it's the same thing. The controversy escalates rapidly. National outrage explodes. Diplomats plead for calm, but it's too late. Here you have a war. Total gross domestic product. The United States is the world's largest economy. The industrial potential, year 1900. Population. The British Empire has over 300 million inhabitants. The military. The empire has a stronger army. In Great Britain, men served in the army for 6 years. The British Royal Navy was the largest and most powerful navy in the world. The United States Navy was much smaller, still transitioning from wooden to steel ships after rebuilding from its post-Civil War decline. Keep in mind that the United Kingdom is much bigger in terms of military power than the United States, but it cannot deploy all its forces in America. They must maintain a large portion of their army to defend the empire worldwide. India, Africa, Mediterranean Sea, China, in addition to keep forces at home. America instead can use all their strength. These are the uniforms of the American Army. These are the uniforms of the British. Both of them, as the war progressed, will adopt more modern camouflage uniforms, as happened in the Boer Wars. Canada is the main front of this war. During the first weeks of the war, the United States has a significant numerical advantage. The U.S. Army has 27,000 regulars. There are also 90,000 National Guard troops, poorly armed and unreliable in attack, but effective in defensive positions. The British in Canada have only around 1,000 Canadian troops and the British 1st Battalion, Royal Berkshires, stationed in Halifax. But the American Army is dispersed throughout the country. East of the Mississippi there are 4,500 infantrymen and only 16 guns. so it will be difficult to quickly concentrate an army on the Canadian border large enough to capture a territory second only to Russia in size, especially since the British will soon rush reinforcements to Canada. Taking the British deployment during the South African Wars in 1899 as a reference, and considering that Halifax or Quebec City, both of which have ports, are 15 days closer than Cape Town, 20 battalions could arrive in Canada within 15 to 25 days. All of them are well-armed and experienced soldiers, more than enough to repel any American invasion attempt. After 35 days, other 10 battalions. An infantry battalion in 1895 typically had a strength of between 500 and 1,000 men, so 30 battalions would amount to at least 20,000 soldiers, roughly matching U.S. forces. Thus, at the beginning of the war, there are only small skirmishes along the border. In the following months, both sides increase their strength. Based on what happened in the Spanish-American War, with full mobilization and a larger number of volunteers, the U.S. Army could have more than 500,000 men in 4 months. The British, during the Boer War in South Africa, after 4 months had nearly 200,000 troops on the ground. In this case, that number could rise to around 300,000. The American forces are more numerous, but less trained and equipped, heterogeneously armed with civilian rifles and anything that American arms manufacturers could produce rapidly. In the first months, the U.S. Army will have a shortage of artillery. The United States has only 56 imported French Hotchkiss cannons and 100 M1885 black powder 81mm cannons, less than a gun per 1,000 troops. While it's true that the U.S. could eventually manufacture its own guns, artillery is not something that can be produced in a hurry. America's main initial problem would not have been a lack of an industrial base, but rather the absence of a dedicated military-industrial base. At sea, the U.S. Navy could not hope to match the Royal Navy. Just 1/3 of the British fleet, 8 modern battleships and 10 older ones, is more than enough to face the 2 battleships of the U.S. Navy. The main British naval bases in North America are Halifax, Bermuda, Kingston, and Esquimalt, Vancouver. Halifax is the premier base of the Royal Navy in the Western Hemisphere. The loss of that base would utterly cripple Britain's naval power and would cut off Canada from all aid. But it's a hard target. The fortifications around Halifax has been continuously modernized and are protected with the guns of the Royal Navy. There would be a blockade of the American coast. While blockade America may seem a large task, remember that the British blockaded the whole European continent on several occasions. In 1805, they blockaded the entirety of Europe against a coalition with France, Spain, and the Netherlands that had 30 times the U.S. Navy. Tirpitz said that Britain's frontiers were at the coasts of her enemies. However, it will not be a close blockade, meaning there will not be 2 battleships stationed in front of every port. It will instead be a distant blockade, similar to that used against Germany during the World Wars. The Royal Navy can concentrate their ships to monitor the major ports while sending cruisers on occasional sweeps, to disrupt coastal traffic around smaller ports. The ports of New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Chesapeake Bay, San Francisco, the entrance of the Mississippi River with New Orleans, and Galveston would have been the first priority. This blockade would not have had the same effects as the one imposed on Germany during World War I. The United States has strong domestic agricultural production, and it does not rely heavily on imports of raw materials or other goods, and unless the British also blockaded Mexico, critical items could still reach the U.S. On the sea, the USA plan essentially replicates the German naval strategy in the First World War. Keep the fleet in the ports and make raids to hurt British shipping. The raids would likely have some success, since the Royal Navy does not use convoy by this time. The port of New York would take most of the U.S. fleet. New York was the best defended port in the country. The entrance to New York Harbor is protected by Fort Hancock. It featured the first disappearing gun battery in the United States. However, it is one of the few ports with coastal defenses. In 1885, the U.S. began a massive construction program for a series of new forts and batteries known as the Endicott Program. But the forts were mostly unfinished until 1910. Wartime urgency could accelerate construction, as it often does, but miracles are not possible. All American ports could be mined, as had occurred during the Spanish-American War, when 28 harbors nationwide were mined. The Royal Navy could attempt landings to capture a port and establish an intact supply point on American soil. Even if the British do not attempt such a landing, the Americans would still need to constantly monitor and defend their coast. There would have been naval bombardments, especially the East Coast. Forts, batteries, dockyards, industries. The British ships has 343 mm guns with shells that weighs 570 kilograms and a firing range of 11 kilometers. There is very little in any major port with the firepower to damage a battleship. However, the damages to the U.S. economy would have been limited, for sure not enough to bring the U.S. to its knees. A naval bombardment in 1895 is not precise, and most American industry is far from the coast. The main purpose of the bombardments is to wear down U.S. public morale. After the British burned a city to the ground, destroying perhaps 50% of its buildings and leaving thousands dead and maimed, the American people would begin to believe that it is stupid to fight for Venezuela and better to leave Canada alone. It's only a bunch of ice inhabited by baby seal killers. However, the bombings could have had the opposite effect, that of making the American people even more angry. We arrive at the end of the first year of war. There have been no main battles or major offensives, and very few changes along the front line. The front begins at Vancouver, a fortified British port. It crosses the mountains and the central regions, too vast for the American army, which is not yet very numerous. Then the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River, difficult to cross for both. The front ends in New Brunswick, where there are trenches and barbed wires. This is not the era of blitzkrieg. It will be a long war. Meanwhile, the world is watching the clash between the two powers. The British Empire has many enemies, but in 1900 everyone had many enemies. This is why the risk of several European powers starting a war against the British Empire simply because it is fighting in America is limited. France can't because of Germany and Italy. Germany can't because of France and Russia. Russia can't because of Germany. Austria-Hungary can't because of… well, you get the picture. This is why, for example, when war broke out between France and Prussia in 1870, no one rushed to seize French colonies. However, that doesn't mean someone might not try to steal a piece of cake from the British plate while they are playing on the other side of the ocean. The Fashoda Crisis was a confrontation that occurred in 1898 between France, that aimed to link its territories from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, and Great Britain, which sought to connect its colonies in South Africa with Egypt. The scene of the crisis was the small Sudanese town of Fashoda, located along the Nile. A French expedition sent to occupy the town found a British army unit already there. The two forces faced each other menacingly for a week or two before the French withdrew, ending the crisis with a British victory. In this chronology, instead, the crisis ends with a French victory, giving France control over southern Sudan and the trade routes of the Sahel. In Central Asia, the British and Russian empires are rivals. Since the British are distracted, the Russians begin to foment revolts in Afghanistan, a British protectorate. Attacks against British garrisons follow, and since the British cannot send reinforcements, they lose control of the region, which reverts to what it had always been: a collection of tribes constantly at war with one another. In Manchuria, Russia forces China to grant mineral concessions, then sends 100,000 soldiers into the region and captures Port Arthur. Russian activity also increases in Tibet and Persia. Russian officers begin serving in the Persian army. Russian settlers arrive in North Iran. The Russians are gaining ground in the Great Game. This is South Africa in 1895. The Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State are ruled by colonists of Dutch origin, known as Boers, with Pretoria as their capital. Britain annexed the two Boer republics after the Second Anglo-Boer War in 1899. In this chronology, the British are forced to avoid conflict with the Boers, who, among other things, proved to be skilled fighters and well-armed. They possessed more guns than the entire U.S. Army. The Transvaal and the Orange Free State remain independent republics. Germans would likely have diplomatically supported the British. Kaiser Wilhelm at the time was quite Anglophile and wasn't exactly a huge fan of the US. Germany would have been more than happy to sell Britain any Krupp artillery it wants to buy and could pay for. For their kindness, the British leave all of Samoa to the Germans. It doesn't matter that Samoa is an American territory. Mexico remains neutral. Although the relationships with USA aren't wonderful, Mexico would need a very convincing reason to risk an invasion. But the possibility that Britain could supply Mexico with guns and use them as cannon fodder, as NATO is today using the Ukrainians against the Russians, or the risk of British seizing Mexican ports to threaten U.S. Gulf supply lines will force the American army to keep part of his force in the South. Meanwhile, nobody cares about Venezuela. Not even you, I think. As you've already understood, Venezuela served only as a pretext for a conflict over something the United States and the British truly cared about. After that, it became irrelevant, like Poland in the Second World War. There is a brief naval blockade, then a brigade of British Royal Marines forces Venezuela to capitulate. When the second year of the war begins, U.S. industry starts producing guns, ammunition, rifles, and everything else in great numbers. The United States is the largest industrial power in the world. It has no long supply lines, and has a vast population from which to draw in building its army. The United States mobilized 4 million men during World War I, and over 1 million during the Civil War. So, in this situation, it should be able to field a force somewhere in between. Perhaps 2.5 million. The British Empire could match those numbers and increase its production as well. But it would not empty its home islands or colonies of troops, as that would leave them vulnerable to virtually any other great power. Thus, the British could field 700,000 to 800,000 men in America. The Canadians might be able to arm about 40,000 men. India would likely provide a large number of troops. While they would not serve in the Americas, many of them could be used to ease British garrison requirements elsewhere, such as in Africa and China. The British Empire is an incredibly potent adversary, but there is no way the British can compete with the Americans on their own soil in the long run. The United States are now unstoppable. The U.S. Army would begin cutting railway lines in central Canada if it had not already done so. Once those lines are cut, any British operations in Western Canada would become untenable. An American army of 50,000 troops can capture Regina, Winnipeg, Calgary, and invade most of central Canada. Warfare in that theater would be mostly between the US cavalry and Canadian militia and will be fluid, as was in Russia during the First World War. There's no way a trench network could have been established along the 4,000 kilometers US-Canadian border. Then there would be the attack on Vancouver and the naval base at Victoria. Capturing a naval fortress is not an easy task. The Japanese lost 100,000 men taking Port Arthur in 1905, and, unlike Vancouver, that city was under naval siege. The Americans might still have managed to capture it, which would make the blockade impossible on the west coast and useless on the eastern coast. In eastern Canada, there would be a mini World War I, with the US Army trying to overcome the British entrenched positions. There would be bloody attacks and a couple of Verdun-style battles. No one is prepared for the bloodbath made possible by modern weapons. In the end, however, the more numerous American troops would begin pushing the British back. Toronto would fall, then Kingston, followed by a major offensive against Montreal, which would be taken after a siege. There would be crossings of the St. Lawrence River at several points. Quebec City would then be captured soon after. The loss of the main cities causes the collapse of the front in Quebec. All operations are stopped in the late winter of 1897. The Canadian winter, with an average temperature of -10 degrees and snowfall often exceeding a meter, makes further advances impossible. The war has essentially reached a stalemate. Most of the British Army has withdrawn into the trenches of New Brunswick, and taking that province would have cost the Americans several 100,000 more men. Having Americans already achieved their main objective, Canada, for sure they can live without New Brunswick, and since it is impossible for the British to retake Canada, a large faction on both sides would probably begin calling for peace. A war of attrition would be nasty for both sides in blood and treasure. There will be a peace conference somewhere, perhaps in Paris. The United States annex most of Canada, gaining its own Lebensraum. Canada is divided into several regions, some becoming American states, and others granted a Puerto Rico-style status, meaning they would have a degree of self-governance, but would ultimately remain under the authority of the United States. The British Empire retains New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Labrador. The United States loses the few territories it possessed in the Pacific. In the Hawaii, the British restore the friendly Hawaiian monarchy. Venezuela is a British protectorate, basically getting the Persian variation of British colonialism, with British companies building railways and exploiting Venezuelan oil reserve. Many Canadians do not lay down their weapons, and guerrilla warfare continues for at least 2 to 3 years, as happened in South Africa after the Boer War. The Canadians use hit-and-run attacks and ambushes, conducting raids against railways and isolated barracks. The campaign proves difficult for the Americans to suppress, due to their unfamiliarity with guerrilla tactics and the strong civilian support for the rebels, as well as some hidden support from the British. The Canadian forests, similar to those in Russia, are among the best terrain on Earth for guerrilla warfare. The Americans would use harsh measures to suppress the revolt. The same methods employed in our timeline by the Americans in the Philippines and by the British against the Boers. A scorched earth policy with the confiscation of food that could sustain the guerrillas. Canadian civilians, mainly women and children, are forcibly relocated to concentration camps, where high death rates from starvation and diseases. Another 10,000 American soldiers could die, and even more Canadians. The war gradually fades after a few years, and most of the remaining fighters emigrate to British-controlled territories. What technologies might emerge early as a result of a large-scale war before 1900? It is too early for tanks and airplanes, but automatic weapons, submarines, metal helmets, and traction engines for artillery could appear. Quite possibly chemical weapons. There will be no Spanish-American War in 1898. Not only because the USS Maine, the ship used by the United States as casus belli, would have already been sunk. The United States lost much of its navy in this war, and would be unable to invade the Philippines and Cuba in 1898. Thus, Spain retains its empire. The United States had widespread devastation in coastal cities, Maine, and the Great Lakes region. Human losses could amount to nearly 1 million men, not only on the battlefields but also from naval bombardment. The economy is in serious difficulty. The United States had to raise taxes and increase debt to fund the army and weapons programs. There will be a period of massive inflation, unemployment, and even poverty in some areas of the country. But, as always happens, the end of a war boosts and stimulates the economy. The newly acquired territories of Canada offer enormous possibilities. Before 1900, the domestic economy is thriving again, and the U.S. enters a period of economic and population growth, as well as technological innovation. President Cleveland, the hero of the Second War of Independence, will win the next presidential election. There are other consequences. The war awakened the United States to its vulnerability. America realized that it must be a military power as well as an economic one, that you cannot build an army when the enemy is already at the gate, and that it takes months to produce those large cannons. The U.S. also recognized the need for a real navy. Soon a naval arms race between the United States and Britain begins. Like all wars, this one helped forge a stronger national identity by giving the people a common enemy. It also served to further mend relations between the American North and South. Many friendships were formed between soldiers from northern and southern states, perhaps the sons of Civil War veterans from opposing sides. A friendship born in a trench lasts forever.
Who won this war? We drove America from the Pacific, gained economic influence in Latin America, and erased that stupid Monroe Doctrine once for all. But the price was the loss of control over Afghanistan. We lost Transvaal. The Russians are gaining influence in Asia. South Sudan is now French. And most importantly, we lost Canada. This is a defeat. However, only those who have fought little have never been defeated. And soon there will be a chance for revenge. Tensions in the world have not diminished at all. The Balkans remain the usual powder keg. The French hate Germany and want Alsace back. The Germans are eager to eliminate France. The Japanese and Russians are about to face each other over Manchuria. The Austrian and Ottoman empires are unstable. The empire must now form a coalition against an enemy, as we have done before, as we did against Napoleon, for example. In this case, the enemy is the United States. Who will be the empire's ally? Perhaps France. But France has no interest in fighting America. Furthermore, there are too many disagreements between us and them in the colonies. France will be an enemy in this war. The same goes for Russia, an ally of France, fairly close to the United States, and an enemy of the empire in Central Asia. Japan is a potential ally, but it will not be enough. Spain will not be able to remain neutral. The United States still threatens what remains of its colonial empire, but it will not be enough. Portugal, our oldest ally, will follow us into this war, yet even then, it will not be enough. Germany, here's the ally. There are disagreements with the Germans here and there, but nothing irreconcilable. In your timeline, during the Spanish-American War in 1896, Germany, foresightedly recognizing the problems the United States will cause Europe in the future, urged a united European stand against America. But, foolishly, no one followed them. Furthermore, the Germans are natural enemies of France and dream of lands in the east. Lands of our enemy Russia. Austria-Hungary will follow Germany. Another good ally. Romania and Serbia are enemies of Austria, but they will remain neutral at first. If the war goes well for us, they will not enter it. Italy is currently allied with Germany and Austria in the Triple Alliance. Here's another good ally. It will be enough to grant them a few lands and colonies. Ottoman lands and French colonies. Our fleet, together with the German, Japanese, and Italian fleets, will dominate the seas. The Ottoman Empire sees the British Empire as a threat, and they are right. They will side with the Americans and the French. But that is not a major problem. It has been in decline for centuries. In fact, it is better this way. After victory, we will finally lay our hands on the Middle East. Greece and Bulgaria will side with the Empire, against the Ottomans. I am not sure what the Netherlands and Belgium will do, but after the German invasion, it will no longer matter. China will probably choose to fight the Japanese. In any case, China is not a problem. This time, the battlefield will also extend to Latin America. Many countries will be forced to choose a side. Although many of their economies depend on American markets and capital, U.S. interference in their internal affairs is widely resented. Venezuela is now our protectorate and, of course, will side with us. Mexico could also be on our side. We will send them a telegram as soon as possible. Colombia may join the empire as well, given the American efforts to separate Panama from Colombia in order to control the Canal Zone. Chile will be on our side. It maintains good relations with Germany. Then Washington supported Peru during the war with Chile in 1879. However, Bolivia and Peru may side with the Americans. Brazil is important. It has 1/3 of the population of all South America, and is an industrializing country with a capable army and navy. It could prove decisive, but has strong ties with the United States, and not just economic ones. In 1864, Brazil and the United States collaborated in a military expedition against Paraguay. Argentina has quarrels with Brazil, and the United Kingdom holds a dominant role in the Argentine economy. Moreover, more than half of its population, and all the ruling class is of Italian, Spanish, English, or German descent. It could be brought over to our side. Ecuador is uncertain. It may side with the United States. There is also French Guiana to consider. Uruguay and Paraguay will oppose Brazil. It will be a world war, the first true world war. And it will begin soon, perhaps before 1905. This time, America will not be allowed to wait 3 years before entering the war.